Miss Sarah. Welcome to First Chapter Friday. Today we're going to read the beginning of Yonder by Ali Standish. It's a really pretty cover, and this book is about a boy named Danny, and he's looked up to this older boy named Jack for many years after he saved two small children from drowning in the big flood of 1940. They quickly become good friends, and Danny looks up to Jack, especially since Danny's father is away, shipped off during World War II, and he's left home with his pregnant mother. So he really looks up to this older boy to help him get through things. Unfortunately, Jack ends up going missing, and Danny makes it his personal mission to find Danny. He left without a trace. Nobody knows what's happening. He thinks maybe he was getting away from his father, or he might be in Yonder, the magic town that Jack has been telling Danny about. So let's see. Beginning is the prologue. It's a little long, so we're only going to read a little bit of it, and hopefully you'll want to read the rest. So, prologue. Every hero has a story. Stories I've learned are a bit like hearts. We've all got one inside, locked away, just out of sight. But just because you know there's a heart beating in the chest of the person standing right beside you doesn't mean you can hear it. Mostly, you never do. Stories are the same way, told in whispers, as often as not. So you have to listen close to hear them. I think you have to listen especially close when it comes to heroes. We all want to see heroes, to pat them on the back and shake their hands and tell them what a swell job they've done and how thankful we are. We want them to be brave, but we don't want to hear what that bravery has cost them. We don't want to know that underneath all that bravery is fear, deep and cold as the Watauga River after the first spring thaw. We don't want to hear their stories, not their true stories anyway. We'd rather tell stories of our own. It was that way when the soldiers went off to war and when they came back home. And it was that way with Jack too. The first time I took notice of Jack Bailey was about the same time lots of folks in Foggy Gap did. It was the summer of 1940 and I was 10 years old. It had been raining for 3 days straight. A hurricane blowing in off the coast had thrown a surprise left hook worthy of a champion prize fighter and came barreling down the Appalachia. The rain was still pouring down and the water was ankle high in some of the streets as we waded to church on Sunday morning. The whole congregation sat soggy and shivering as Pastor Douglas shouted over the storm. He gave an especially heated sermon that morning, like he thought maybe the fire in his voice could drive the damp cold from our pews. It was as he banged his fist against the pulpit to emphasize the power of the Lord's will that the church groaned and seemed to give a great lurch like a spooked horse. Before Pastor Douglas could say another word, half the congregation was running for the doors to see what was going on. Thankfully, my family's normal pew was toward the back, which meant I was able to squirm through the adults gathering on the church steps to see what they were staring at. The Watauga had burst its banks, and the dirt road that separated the river from the church had now completely disappeared under swiftly flowing water, the color of Daddy's morning coffee. In fact, half the church steps were already underwater. My best friend Lou shoved in next to me. "Look, Danny," she cried out gleefully as she gripped my arm. "There goes Miss Maynard's car." Mrs. McGuire quickly clapped a white-gloved hand over Lou's mouth, but then the rest of us had already spotted the brand-new Oldsmobile being carried away by the water. From behind me, I heard a man who could have only been Mr. Maynard yell something that certainly had never been uttered on those church steps before. Quick as a flash, Lou's mother's hands moved from Lou's mouth to her ears. Then someone else cried out. People began to point to an object floating toward us. As it drew closer, I saw it wasn't one object, but two, and that they weren't objects at all, but two little girls, the Combs twins, who had stayed home from church that morning on account of having the chicken pox. Were floating side by side in the river, flailing and sputtering for breath. "They'll drown," shouted Mrs. Updike as the twins neared. "Somebody do something." There was a moment's pause when we all searched ourselves for the courage to jump in, each one of us finding instead an excuse not to. Then, from somewhere to my left, I heard a familiar voice, one that never failed to make me flinch. "My daddy can do it," Bruce Pittman cowed. "He's the best swimmer in town." And with that, all eyes turned from the twins to the Pittmans. Mr. Pittman stood behind Bruce. His face was sallow, his knuckles turned white on his son's shoulders. His features were pinched like he had just stepped in a steaming pile of horse manure. Mr. Pittman's eyes flickered to the bobbing heads in the swift-churning church. He licked his lips. "They're going under," squealed Mrs. McGuire, as the two tiny heads disappeared beneath the water. Mr. Pittman opened his mouth to say something, but we never found out what it was. An elbow jutted into my ribs as people were pushed aside. Then, the flash of someone diving into the water. He was tall, but his shoulders narrow, a boy who wasn't quite yet a man. So that is the beginning of the prologue of Yonder by Ali Standish. If you'd like to find out what happens to Danny or the two girls that are possibly drowning outside the church steps, give us a call or come visit us in the children's department at the library. Bye, friends!